Ladies and gentlemen, friends of Polish Institute of International Affairs, our virtual audience today, due to this pandemic circumstances, we organized this very special meeting with the leader of Central Europe, one of the most outstanding politicians in this part of the world, and I would say also the leader in transatlantic affairs, transatlantic community, President of Estonia, Kersti Kaljulaid. Thank you very much, Madam President, for being with us. It is not your first time when you visit the Institute, and I can say that you are not only a leader of Central Europe, you are not only a friend of Poland, because you pay quite often visits to our country, but I can add here a small footnote. You are a true friend of the Polish Institute of International Affairs, and I would like to thank you very much for this.
Thank you for the invitation once again, and indeed, thank you for your very kind words. We all try to do our best to contribute to the world and its security, as you well know.
Yes, and now on both sides of the pond, we have very intriguing intellectual / expert / political debate about the future of the world and by what circumstances, what the framework this future will be organized. So there is a debate about United States, China, rivalry, competition, new kind of the relationship between these two powers. My first question to you is where you should see Estonia, Central Europe, and Europe in this debate, at least, about the future of the world?
Well, if I think globally, I feel that the most urgent issue nowadays is the safety of humankind, as we all know. And obviously, when you have certain urgency, then always you would have this debate, how to best achieve the results we urgently need to achieve. And the role of Estonia and Poland and Europe in this game, and I also believe strongly supported by our transatlantic partners, is to prove that free democratic societies, where quite a lot depends on people understanding the state of play, understanding where we are going, and understanding what we need to do to be safe in the future, plays an important role, because there is always the alternative. People who are very impatient within even our own societies say that, democracy doesn't give us clear guidance, clear direction, hence a kind of more controlled societal development might be beneficial to save humankind. And with this pandemic, I feel that this is the debate which is strongly enhanced, like all trends in our societies, of course, are strongly enhanced by the pandemic. But it's becoming very obvious that we cannot neglect the changes we are causing to our planet. We need to act. How to act? Remaining free and remaining in the democratic world. These are the very important questions.
So do you think that this future will be shaped by the outcome, the ultimate outcome of the debate, which systemic way of the government will prove the most efficient for the society? Do we have ideological clash here?
I don't know whether we have a clash, but we have a competition, definitely, because with the rise of China, it's quite easy to think that, sustainable economic development, doing it also environmentally sustainably, is only achievable by dirigism. And if you look at the Chinese development of the last decades, it appears to that indeed in a controlled society, you can cause economic development. Whereas our paradigm, of course, is that economic development is only unleashed by free agents. And I see that there is a clear competition which we are going to win, and you know why? Because in the long term, you can indeed achieve middle-income country status, even maybe upper middle-income country status. But from then on, the productivity rise which you need is so much related to the creativity of your people. And creativity is only unleashed in long term only by true freedom, by true liberties to your own people. You cannot be creative to a certain extent as long as party allows you, and then, leave your empire and disappear from the scheme, which can easily happen. For this kind of long-term sustainable economic growth, green included, you need to be truly creative, and only free people are creative. That we know.
There is a view in Europe that in this competition or the process of shaping a new kind of relationship between Washington and Beijing, Europe should be somewhere in the middle, a kind of the middle ground, equidistant. How do you feel about it? Should we rather be vocal that we are allies of the United States in this very tricky relationship, or indeed we should take a middle ground?
First of all, I would like to say that this changed geopolitical picture, where indeed US has to pay much more attention to the new competition in Asia, changes for us quite many aspects. If we look back towards the Cold War times, for example, then our regional unpredictable neighbor, the risk, well, not for us then, because we were occupied, you were also at the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, but for the West, it was obviously also the global risk. They coincided. It was a very comfortable situation for Europe to be in, actually, because all the transatlantic bond was dealing with containing Soviet Union. Now the situation has changed, and for us in Europe, before we start discussing where we stand in the discussions and competition between China and US, where it is obvious we stand with our values, which means we stand with US, of course, but we need to make sure that we take clear responsibility for our own surroundings. And if you have noticed in the last years, even the politicians who come from Southern Europe, who normally think differently of geopolitics than we here tend to do. But you remember maybe High Representative Borrell in his first Munich Security Conference in this role, he said that Europe needs to be assertive, but to be assertive, Europe needs capabilities. I mean, can you imagine hearing something like that from European Union Foreign Policy Agency 25 years ago? Definitely not. So we are assuming our responsibility in Europe, and this means why we are spending more on our defense, why we are cooperating more among ourselves in Europe. This is not, I mean, in competition with US or besides NATO or US, it's always to complement what we have and to take our ends responsibility for us.
But this leads me to a more specific question about the region. The region quite often has been called as a Trojan horse, either because we are, so friendly to the Americans or more friendly than the others, or sometimes, recently, we can hear that we are more friendly to the Chinese than the others. So, do you think that this description of Central Europe as a kind of middle ground between Western Europe, China, and United States can play independent, sovereign role?
Well, the question is always that the perception of the others, where does it stem from? Is it fair? Is it fair to think that we are more somehow sensitive to Chinese investment, for example? My answer is, how can we be? I mean, we are all part of the European Union. We apply the same procurement and competition rules. Hence, we are protected from predatory capital similarly, and we can prove it. I mean, in Estonia, there is about one Chinese investment, and it is into private company, and it is clearly a financial investment, which doesn't even expose any new markets for the company. So we cannot say that Eastern Europe, the part of it which is included into the European Union, is more sensitive to Chinese capital. But the same cannot be said to our Eastern partners countries, to the Balkan friends who are not yet part of the European Union, because of course you need development resources, and if this is offered, you take the cheapest offer. And we haven't seen this in Europe, but we have seen this, for example, in Africa, where whole economies have been taken over, glass ceilings have been created for local SMEs and other capital, which is not Chinese capital, because China, through these special agreements with the governments in those countries, have exceeded the bigger parts of the business and the most lucrative parts of the business, and there is no space for the others. So actually, it's economically harming and politically crippling. And we have to be aware that unless you are, protected like we are, there is this issue and this element. So indeed, the answer is yes and no in the region. But I don't think that we feel a specific affinity somehow to Chinese capital. Simply, if you are from Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, where do you get the money? That is the question. We don't have this question. We have EU finances, we have Free Seas Initiative, but they have this question. Now, coming to this question, whether we are more friendly to Americans for some reason. European partners and allies are also very much relying on the US capabilities. We always, freely admitted that we cannot organize an independent mission, let's say in North Africa, if we needed it, without the US troops. We should be able to. So I don't see that this is in competition. It's just that we have been very straight talking about the lack of capabilities in Europe. And we have, of course, been very open for the US capabilities in Europe and continue to advocate for that. And this has been, for the last 30 years, the story.
Thank you very much, Madam President. It is in a virtual meeting. We do have virtual audience, and we also have designated speakers, those who would ask questions. So that's the time for these questions. I would like to ask Dr. Beata Gurka-Winter, Assistant Professor at the Center for Europe, Warsaw University. Beata, do you hear us?
My question will be about NATO. Over the last few years, NATO and the US have in a lot of measures aiming and strengthening the eastern flank of NATO, including military, cyber, air defense capabilities. What can we do more as eastern flank countries to create even more security in the region? What should we advocate for in the upcoming new NATO strategy? Should we concentrate on military, or some other ideas or approaches should be introduced as well? Thank you.
Well, if we start with the brief historic excursion into the, let's say, the period post-2014, NATO being, struggling with scarce resources, our spending, despite the Wales decision, was nowhere near 2% taken Europe as a whole or NATO as a whole. Put up a very smart, cheap and clever move, the EFP. It's a tripwire, but it involves, I think it was 18 or 19 NATO nations, which means that it's a clear and visible sign that we all invested into the region. It was the best NATO could do. Thank you, Mr. Stoltenberg, for that. I think this was genius, pure genius. Now, what this has done to us was that it started to inform both NATO headquarters and the politicians of NATO member states about what is going on the ground. They started to think differently of the risks. Their risk perception started rapidly to coincide with our risk perceptions of the region. Because if you have hundreds of soldiers in the region, you have to understand that, for example, if there will be the A2AD bubble created by Russians and you cannot bring in additional forces, follow-on forces, you are in deep trouble with so many soldiers in the region if something goes wrong. So we started to think a little bit more, exercise more, realize also that, NATO and its capability to provide territorial defense was rusty a little bit because it hadn't been the case. The systems which had to interoperate always did not interoperate. All these technical issues came up, tactical issues came up, and strategic issues came up. And NATO started to build on it. There is a management structure which is developing. For example, for Estonia, Latvia, in Adaži, we have a multinational division North, which is the place basically which has to be ready to help and support incoming follow-on forces if that were necessary. So from the EFP, we have seen how NATO's deterrence capacity in the region has been growing. Now, where I think we should put our next level of exercise is actually the political or strategic level. Politicians also need to be exercised in their thinking that if something starts to go radically wrong, they are ready to react quickly. We see already the army armies of the EFP countries, they are, when we do strategic exercises, they are very much thinking ahead, differently. And I believe that at political level, the first sign that this has been achieved, that we are also more nimble at the political level, was the rapid recognition that something weird is going on close to Ukrainian borders. It meant something less actually was going on definitely behind our own borders, because some of the equipment was moved from close to Baltic states and Poland towards Ukraine. But it was first time ever when ex ante, I believe, things were taken seriously, also at the political level, which I believe had a deterring effect also vis-à-vis Ukraine. So we see that from the EFP, from something which was rapidly put together, we are coming to the strategic thinking which is more beneficial, let's say, or more useful to defend northeast corner of NATO. And I strongly suggest that we praise this development, continue this development, continue exercises even at the ministerial level if needed, and make sure that NATO is a strong 360 degrees, that this situational awareness is not limited to northeast, because we know that there are many surrounding regions where similar vigilance, similar structured approach is needed. And I believe that what we have learned can serve NATO 360 degrees.
So, Madam President, do you think that NATO 2016 communique of Warsaw about strategic posture should be a first step towards our future 2030 strategy, or rather the end of some kind of thinking?
As I said, what has been achieved in our corners should be mainstreamed for the whole NATO and also for all domains. And where I see where NATO has a lot of room to develop, and I hope it will develop, and we've been having discussions, for example, in Munich Security Conference, me and the Portuguese Minister of Defense discussed this, that NATO has to go more into technology. And this is now already thinking at the global scale, because the main problem nowadays is that the new technology, which used to be always created by states and its military, nuclear weapons, you couldn't imagine could have been developed, in the private sector. Then now we have passed a bifurcation point between free world and less free world in the development of technology. In our part of the world, artificial intelligence technology develops in the private sector. We don't have the control of that, and it is not naturally incorporated into our defense thinking. Whereas in China, for example, it clearly and obviously is. And we should recognize this, that we have this lack of capability to understand how technology could enhance and support our military capabilities. And we need to make a conscious effort to make sure that we are not missing out there. And I know NATO is indeed doing this, and I think it should be doing this more actively. And quite a lot of the resources which NATO is getting from rising the defense spending should actually be dedicated to artificial intelligence, its research in applied military science. And this is something which we cannot miss, because, the problem here is that if you compare it to 20th century, then, the new risks basically eliminated some of the old risks, but the cyber and artificial intelligence linked risks only accumulate on top of the old. The olds have not gone away. So it is an even more complex picture for which NATO needs to have awareness.
Now, microphone goes to Justyna Gotkowska, the head of Regional Security Program, Center for Eastern Studies. Justyna?
Thank you, Madam President. You talked about Eastern flank, and my question is about the Eastern neighborhood. How should NATO and possibly the EU develop security and defense cooperation with willing Eastern partnership countries in order to increase security and resilience in our neighborhood? Thank
you. Maybe it's because of our own history, but we were quite aware in 90s. First comes Union, then comes NATO. And we realized that, if we are accepted as EU members, then we have the chance also to join NATO. And meanwhile, it has been vice versa. NATO has been expanding maybe more readily than the European Union. But considering also that some of our Eastern partners, and they happen to be those who have European aspirations, Georgia and Ukraine, and maybe because they have these European aspirations, are partially occupied. So the worst thing we have done in thinking of the future and safety of these countries is that as soon Russia bites a little bit out of somebody's territory, we drop them like hot potato. We shouldn't. We should actually show clearly that these countries, despite being partially occupied, have the European perspective as well. And if they have the European perspective, I mean, it's not really an issue or which we should somehow have doubts about, that can partially occupied Georgia or partially occupied Ukraine form part of our common markets and for freedoms. Why not? Yes, conditionality is extremely important, and I stand for very strong conditionality. There has to be rule of law, there has to be equal treatment of all kinds of capital, there have to be human rights which are expected, there has to be media freedom, and all these things, they have to be guaranteed. But I mean, with these conditions, we should involve into our discussions about enlargement of the Union also the Eastern Partnership countries. Otherwise, what have we taught to Russia? Bite them, they drop them. And this is wrong. NATO is doing what it can do. NATO is offering partnership and quite a lot of support. NATO countries and our officers are training in both countries. We are also learning, unfortunately, quite a lot from Ukrainian experience with direct military conflict. But what we should do, we should offer more on political side. And this means, in this case, European Union.
Russia has been introduced for the first time into our debate, was mentioned by Madam President. There is a plan, a lot of talk that President Biden is going to meet Vladimir Putin soon, somewhere in Central Europe. What should be message of the free world to Vladimir Putin delivered by President Biden?
I think you already delivered one quite strong message, which I believe reasserted quite a lot of American principle stance on the world scene, and it's not only vis-à-vis Russia. We can also think vis-à-vis Turkey, for example, and I have to say that I am really, I cannot say positively surprised, but very happy to see how actively President Biden has been reasserting US role and position in multilateral world and making sure that our rules-based world order has a chance to survive. So on this background, I feel quite, safe, and I'm looking forward eagerly to see their first contact because we know that it will be on the strong foundations. And, you know, when you are talking with an unpredictable adversary, being strong is a value in itself. If you go to the bear's nest, you have to be ready to wrestle a little bit as well. And I see the signs that there is a certain readiness to be assertive, to seek actively and be strong in seeking the solutions. And we may see interesting developments. On the other hand, I know we are all very impatient to see Crimea return to Ukraine and conflicts resolved. And sometimes we tend to be overeager to resolve the conflict and hereby giving away a little bit of the long-term objective which we are hoping to achieve. I believe this happened after Georgian war. I mean, Europeans quite quickly took the position that, okay, independence of Georgia was saved, good enough, let's go back to business as usual, by which we taught Russia that, I mean, we don't discuss rearranging the world order from rules-based to power-based, but if you act, we don't react. And that's why we had Crimea. That was the same process. And we shouldn't allow this to happen. So we also need to have strategic patience. If we cannot return Crimea to Ukraine in the next decade, so be it. We were occupied 50 years. And our predecessors had this strategic patience for 50 years. To wait until we regained our independence because history opened the window of opportunity. They regularly sent us signs that this is ongoing. 1980 Moscow Olympic Games were partially held on occupied territory. Some didn't come because of that.
But there are strategists on various places, there's no need to mention them, who say that, okay, let's have a kind of a trade-off. Let's say that Crimea goes to Russia forever, but Ukraine would become a member of NATO instead. What would you say to this kind of thinking? How do you comment?
I mean, this kind of thinking stems from a simple fact that we see Ukraine as somebody about whom we talk, who might be we. I'm sorry. Ukraine is the only country who can take this kind of decisions for its own future. So we should support Ukraine in its discussions with Moscow. This is very important, and this is very often overlooked. And this plays into Moscow's hand, not only in the case of Ukraine, but also with the smaller neighbors in this geopolitically sensitive region as well. They like to talk about us, not with us, and I think we shouldn't actually promote this kind of approach, definitely not. We are ourselves capable to talk applying the European 5 principles to our unpredictable eastern neighbor, with all due respect. And similarly, I believe Ukraine doesn't need this kind of mediation which goes above their head. So this question is not for us.
Thank you very much. Very strong message from the President of Estonia. Democracy does matter, also international affairs. And now the mic goes to Wojciech Lorenz, Senior Research Fellow, Polish Institute of International Affairs. Wojciech, the floor is yours.
Madam President, we have recently seen a significant mobilization of Russia's troops close to Ukraine's borders in a clear attempt to intimidate Ukraine and probably the West. How do you assess Russia's motives, NATO's and EU's reactions, and what could we do better if there were similar threats in the future? Thank you.
As I already said, I felt that this time, first time ex ante, we got our voice together and we know that the tensions were somewhat eased. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny win, which we shouldn't even consider a win, considering what is still going on in Donetsk and the rest of eastern Ukraine. But exactly this kind of rapid in-advance reaction is what we do expect. I wouldn't speculate on why it all took place. I mean, there are speculations galore, and none of us knows, frankly. But we know that the outcome for a time being, for a while, is that the tensions are somewhat eased. Let's see where it takes us.
Now the next question from Dr. Marcin Terlikowski, Head of International Security Program, also the Institute.
Good morning, Madam President. I would like to shift, if possible, the discussion more to European Union and security. We can see that there is an ongoing debate about the need to develop European military capabilities, to endow the EU with military capacities which could allow it to take more burden in assuring peace and security at home and in its neighborhood. Do you see it as something what is inevitably leads to a tension and rivalry between NATO and European Union, something what may undermine transatlantic bond? Or we can devise a way how the EU could fit into NATO defense and deterrence potential? And if yes, how could we achieve this synergy and cooperation? Thank you.
First of all, I don't mind too much via which movements, organizations and activities Europe achieves this capacity to take care of its own surroundings. And I strongly welcome all the ideas which work towards this idea. On the other hand, all these acronyms which we all can pronounce, PESCO, card review, etc., this is talk, this is not money, this is not capability. And I've always asked, yes, let's imagine we are having a nice little card review in Brussels, sitting there and analyzing how have European capabilities then developed in the last years. And we come to the conclusion, for example, that Estonia still doesn't have air defense. Because not that it is not spending 2%, it is spending 2% and even more, simply it's a small economy. What shall we do about it? Do we do something about it? Yes, European Treaty expresses verbis says we cannot support each other's military capabilities. But European Treaty also says we do not underwrite each other's debts. Yet we have the European Stability Mechanism. We could similarly have in European defense cooperation, European defense mechanism for those countries who are willing to participate in permanent structured cooperation, which is what for PESCO stands. I mean, people normally don't know that it has nothing to do with defense specifically. It's just a mechanism of a treaty. But I mean, I have nothing against if we did it. But then if we first promise to put 6 billion into military mobility and then put less than 2, which is common for the trans-European projects, because finally when we go with the budget to the council, it's each to their own envelope. Nobody stands for science, defense, and all these kind of common projects. If we are able to change all that, I'm very happy, and I don't see absolutely no competition between NATO and EU in this case. If it's only talk, then it's just noise, and noise is always bad because it makes the signal less clear. On the other hand, indeed, does Europe need independent capabilities? Yes, it does. Does, for example, Estonia participate in military operations which are extra NATO? Yes, it does. We are in Mali already with our biggest contingent, in fact, is in Mali with French. So we are ready to cooperate, ready to contribute. We never want to be only consumers of security, always contributors through all these channels. But let's be transparent, fair, and honest. I mean, let's be practical, not political. If that can be achieved, I'm very happy.
Estonia has developed excellent working relationship with France and with you personally, Madam President, with President Macron. How he can improve his vision of European strategic autonomy to be more acceptable for our societies in our part of the world?
I guess it's part of the who gives the signal. I think President Macron speaks more or less the same what I spoke now. En français, bien sûr, mais la même chose. Pas de différence. But if it is an Estonian who speaks this, it doesn't somehow sound like competing, trying to compete. And if it's President Macron who speaks the same thing, it sounds like there is some kind of competition. I don't think there is really. I think we are all in it together. We are on the same value base, and we very well know that, I mean, we protect our value sphere. We all depend on it. And hence, I think, I'm not sure he can do much, but if we really understood that, I mean, his objective could be beneficial, and he may have actually an honest objective from our Eastern European viewpoint, which I think personally that he does have, then I think we could actually have a pretty sensible debate about what Europe could contribute, and it definitely should contribute more.
So now the floor goes to Tomasz Żurnaczuk, the head of Central Europe Program, Polish Institute of International Affairs. Tomasz?
Thank you for your refreshing notes. Estonia proved to be active in 3Cs initiative and pays special attention to developing its digitalization agenda, which you already marked or underlined today. After the experience with the COVID-19 pandemic, what, in your opinion, are the other TSI covered areas in which cooperation should be strengthened both regionally and bilaterally between Poland and Estonia? Thank you.
Indeed, 3Cs initiative is for 3Cs countries an achievement of which we are very proud, both in Poland and in Estonia. It's now practical. It could be even more structured. We support the establishment of a permanent secretariat now that we have a permanent and really, I mean, concrete part to the initiative. And this pandemic, what did it really change? It exposed the trends. It didn't create the trends, but it exposed the trends. I can tell that before the pandemic, for more than 3 years, I had been going around Europe and telling everybody that, I mean, probably already about 1/3 of our jobs are geography neutral. We should open the discussion about global services market. How can people from Tunisia and from Vanuatu participate in European labor market, offer us services, do it safely, but also how would we then, I mean, tax and serve our people when they are working in this global way? And it was always considered an interesting idea, but it was not considered something which is an ongoing trend. Now this was exposed, for example. So we obviously now have a case which I believe we owe also to the victims of the pandemics. I mean, they gave their lives for us to see. So we are now responsible to make use of this, what has been developed. And smart connectivity, digital connections between 3Cs countries is even more important. And we see that all European countries are struggling to establish digital ecosystems maybe PAR Estonia, who is struggling to update and keep developing and not to be too satisfied with what we have. But they're struggling. But European Union actually is helping. During the German presidency, there was an agreement that each and every European should have an ADAS-compatible digital ID. I believe we should actually rush forward with free seas countries, and Estonia is ready to offer our common institute, Nordic Institute of Interoperability, as a partner for free seas countries to quickly roll out an infrastructure which would help us to have digital ID, which works across the region. It's easy to do only if we want to take this kind of decision. And it's obvious now that we need it, because in order to work from the distance, you need to, in order to have access to data or systems, you need to identify yourself. And you need to do this cross-border, at least in Europe, because we are a common market. I mean, it doesn't make sense if I can only identify myself in Estonia. Polish entrepreneurs who work in Estonian companies, they are Estonian e-residents. But we don't want to make all free seas population 100 million Estonian e-residents. We'd rather roll it out for the whole region and also, I mean, this way help the development of the region.
Why not? And, beautiful country.
Yes, but then apply simply. You simply have to apply, and then you get your e-residency card, and you can, I mean, at grassroots level, benefit from it. But to have a general effect and also a catalyzed effect on the rest of the Europe, I believe we need to do it cross-region. Because if there is anything where Europe is nowadays ahead in technological development from US, it's GovTech. I mean, there is no such infrastructure demand, even at the level of decision, like we have ADAS-compatible digital IDs. But with that, you cannot digitally transform a society, which is also an interesting point, because very often we think governments don't have influence on societies. It is all private sector. The only nation considered fully digitally transformed is Estonia, which is far less digital in its private sector than Germany and far more in public sector.
Would this pandemic help us to understand, I believe, and also our societies, is the difference between being a member of the European Union and being outside. European Union, however, criticized by the complicated decision-making process, quarrels about different things, proved to be quite effective in responding the crisis. But we still have neighbors outside of the European Union who struggle with vaccinations, who struggle with the access to vaccines. What the European Union can do to regain its magnet for our neighboring friends, our neighboring nations?
I totally agree that this has been unfair, how the vaccines have not reached, for example, our eastern partners. We have established the COVAX facility, and I believe that by midsummer, these issues will start to resolve. From the other hand, I've never been, too idealistic about the human nature. It's first oxygen mask on yourself and then on your neighbor, and this is how it is, and this was also what we saw, when the pandemic struck. But where Europe really comes in is indeed to first of all strongly support that the COVAX will deliver for nations not only around us but further afield, because unless everybody is vaccinated, the virus will have the chance to keep mutating, and this is not in anybody's interest, including in our own, sitting in our ivory towers. We're still affected by it because we want to venture outside of our towers. So this is important. The other thing which is important about the Union is to concentrate on its core business. The 4 freedoms. We lost some of the 4 freedoms pretty rapidly, and we're still struggling to get them back. And whenever a country faces high numbers of infection, or some new version, we see, interesting political developments. Europe is at its best when it deals with its core business, and its core business is deepening the 4 freedoms, and this is the best it can keep doing. And then it's really good in projecting its values, but projecting its values indeed means COVAX nowadays very much, and I share the bitter feeling of President Zelensky, who was here to celebrate in Poland the 3rd of May Constitution, who says there is much more talk and much less vaccines. Because us, we are not perfect, we are mere humans as well. But I believe that nevertheless it has promoted and it will promote quicker vaccine delivery also to those countries.
Don't you think that this situation enhances kind of the moral argument in favor of enlarging European Union? That actually, if something really bad happens, like this pandemic, we cannot deny people wanting to become members of the European Union this perspective.
I don't know. For me, the moral argument has been there since 1994, when Estonia got the invitation to start negotiations to join the Union, because coming from behind the Iron Curtain, it's our moral obligation not to let the bus doors to close and drive away with us simply safely on board. And I'm using this bus metaphor because I remember in 1997 I was in Brussels and I saw a bus, and on that bus was written NATO. And we were joking relatively bitterly, if it only were so easy, you get into the bus and you are in the NATO. So I think we should, it's our moral obligation, and it's always been, and this case, indeed, maybe it has been exposed to those who do not think and share this way of thinking, but for us, nothing has changed. Yes, these countries should have the European perspective, and indeed it should be conditional on their development. And when I am in these countries, then there is another important element which I believe they need to keep in mind. All these reforms are not for joining the European Union. All these reforms are necessary for your own economic development. Whether Europe is forthcoming or not, you need kind of independent justice system. You need rule of law. You need freedoms for development, for yourself. But you also need to understand that, I mean, the window of opportunity one day will open, 9 o'clock in the morning. And if you are not through this window, all Copenhagen criteria fulfilled, by 11:30, it closes again.
This leads me to yet another country of our region, which is not a part of European Union, where we can see on the streets of its capital people wearing not only white, red, white flags, but also blue ones with the 12 golden stars. Do we have a message to these people, and what kind of the message it should be? I mean Belarus.
Yes, I understood you mean Belarus, but I was thinking about the blue flags, because when the protest started, the signals we got also from Belarusian people and the opposition was that all they are standing for is the right to decide. So not for deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, but rather fulfillment of Helsinki Final Acts. Everybody has the right to independently decide. And this has been also my message to our Western European partners, that Belarus is a different country. Its economic ties are very close with Russia, and they don't see their economic future in cutting those ties. We here may think and have proof in our own history that if you start separating yourself from the Soviet ecosystem, you are thrown out of it, booted out of it rather radically and rapidly. Gas prices will be exorbitant. I mean, all economic ties which were beneficial could be cut very suddenly. And this basically restructures your economy anyway, and the only place you can then go with your economy in a pitiful state is this deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. But Belarusian people need to grow to this. Right now, all they are demanding is the right to decide democratically who is their leader. And then they can have a peaceful debate about how quickly, in which direction they are moving. And we shouldn't actually accept, and we should always be very vocal about this Russian strategic communication message that Europe is trying to establish its sphere of influence in Belarus. Sphere of influence is something which Russia thinks in. We think rule of law, Helsinki Final Act. We stand for the Belarusian people's right to decide, and we are very comfortable if they choose differently.
President Lukashenko has been complaining about European Union and United States that we failed Belarus in helping this, to fight with the pandemic. However, of course, much earlier, he had criticized all those who believe that pandemic is real. How we should deal with President Lukashenko in this, very complicated political circumstances in the ground?
Well, I would never analyze contradicting messages of non-democratic leaders, frankly speaking. So whatever has been said, I mean, it's quite obvious that the way of thinking of the free world, that, I mean, we don't really mind where you stand and where you want to go, but we mind that you have the right in democratic format to decide. And I believe that our opponents sincerely and honestly don't understand this aspiration. And this is our strength. And if somebody, and this is, we hear it quite often, not only from Belarus, that from other countries as well, that we somehow fail them by not offering clear perspectives, by not doing more, helping more. But the thing is, we are ready to work with you as closely as your political and social system allows us to do. If it's totally harmonized, I mean, looks like very much like our own, we have discussion why not to enlarge. And this was the same in 1990s. And we can testify, both Poland and Estonia, for that. I mean, it was not like European Union said that if you do these and these and these things, you can join the Union. It was rather that we want to be free nations, democratic nations. Will you accept us if we have managed to reform ourselves? And the answer was yes, we are even ready to help you to reform yourself, but the work is yours.
One comment from my side. I believe that our authoritarian leaders know perfectly well that the people may vote them out. That's why they don't really like the elections and all these procedures. Now I would like to
Understatement of the year, I think.
And I would like to give the floor to Dr. Patrycja Sasnal, the head of the research and the host of your last visit to Polish Institute of International Affairs.
Madam President, thank you very much for these truly politically and intellectually intriguing remarks, and I'm not saying this out of courtesy. You seem to have emphasized in your talk the importance of climate change and fighting the climate crisis. Yet we are in this dilemma in Europe whether to go forward with economic development really fast because we're not doing very well and put the climate a crisis somewhere further down the line. We need to cross the desert first before we can take care of the trees. Now, I wonder what you think about this and how important is the leadership of Europe in fighting the climate crisis? And also, how do you translate that to the European publics? The importance of having to sacrifice maybe, or there isn't a need for sacrifice? Thank you.
First of all, it's not political debates. I mean, the laws of thermodynamics do not really listen to political debate. And by definition, the laws of thermodynamics tell that, I mean, human activity on this planet in the extremely long term, well, cannot end really well, let's put it this way. It's for us to decide whether it will end badly in 100 years, in 1,000 years, or maybe we can even postpone it more. And whether that means that giving up something, yes, it would be smartest probably to give up on a lot what we are doing to, I mean, simply slow down this thermodynamic process, which happens despite whatever we do. But we probably are not ready to do that. What we are ready is, we are ready to change our habits to a certain extent. What we are not as a society is ready to accept is that we will tax consumption to the level that it really hurts poor people and middle-income people, but not the rest. And this way we try to kind of suppress consumption. What we are ready to use energy which comes from different sources. Maybe indeed say 5%, 10% smart grids help us to, I mean, lower the production capacity need by 25%, we think, in Estonia. But that's about the flexibility, what we have. Now, in my understanding, such a change involves economic growth. And I always say in my own country, first ones win and the last ones pay. Estonians have demonstrated this in digital development. Nowadays, you don't buy even a single electronic tax board for the whole money which Estonia has ever spent on digital development. And our companies are benefiting from the fact that others have to buy. So Europe has the world's richest and biggest market, has an opportunity, but also an obligation, because we are this world's richest and biggest market. And now this is the time for us to save this planet. So we create a green bubble by declaring 2050 neutrality. We take decisions which make private sector to believe it, which directs investment into the green technologies, which then on this big market will thrive, become cheaper, and will become available elsewhere. We have this obligation to this planet because, I mean, this is the real political power of the European Union, which we have, our big, mighty economy. Nobody's bigger yet. And if we are smart, we will also win from this. Does it mean sacrifices in the short term? I don't think so. I mean, just transition process in Europe has been created precisely to make sure that the burden of this transition will not be like the burden of industrialization process transition, where simple people who didn't anymore get work on the fields had to go to the towns and live in unhuman conditions in the first phases of industrialization. We can do it smarter because our societies are more developed by today, but it is European obligation as the richest, biggest global market.
Madam President, my last question concerns 230th anniversary of the Third Might Constitution. You came to Poland to celebrate this this event, this historical event, and many others leaders of the region also came here to pay a tribute to a certain idea. What actually brings all these leaders and nations, societies now to also to, you know, what's attractive in this historical documents that we want our societies to remember? What's the message?
I believe all these states, when we celebrate the well-written expansion of the humankind's understanding of the rights of each and everyone, they are the dates to take also stock where our societies have developed, how our democratic processes are delivering for the whole society and for different parts of this society, and how to make sure that even if our democracies are delivering different societies, that we do analyze always who are the winners, who might be at risk to lose. And this concerns both universal human rights, minority rights, but also the right for urban dwellers and rural population, for example, in this green change, the rights of rich people and the rights of poor people and the less well-off people. And even, I would say today, relating to the pandemics, the right of being not vaccinated, compared to the right, for example, or the obligation of the children to go to school. For example, I have 2 children in school. They are both below the age where they can be vaccinated today in Europe. Am I obliged to send them to school if the teacher has no obligation to be vaccinated? I don't know the answer, but our parliaments and our democratic processes should deliver us these answers always. No society is perfect, as we explained. Humankind, well, is like that, but we should always strive for as equal and human treatment of each and everyone in this society. And for me, each and every this kind of holiday or anniversary celebrates this debate. Not the status quo, not the state of play where we are or where we arrived when the document was approved, because we know in history things have been far worse thereafter and far better. But to celebrate this opportunity to discuss.
Ladies and gentlemen, we had an almost pleasure to participate, talk and discuss with outstanding politicians, European politicians, outstanding leader of Central Europe. The leader not only in political sense, but I would also say intellectual. Madam President, thank you very much. That was a great pleasure, great honor to host you at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The pleasure was also mine, and thank you for all the smart questions we received.